The wolf snarled at everyone who tried to own him, but the only person he ever chose was the girl who expected nothing in return. The winter wind swept through Raven Hollow with a sharp bite that slipped beneath coats and settled deep into the bones. Frost covered the rooftops, and thin ribbons of smoke curled from weathered chimneys as the pack prepared for the Winter Moon Festival, the grand celebration where strength was admired, status was displayed, and the weakest members quietly learned exactly where they belonged. Emily Carter kept her head down as she crossed the snowy lane, carrying a small basket filled with herbs gathered before sunrise. At 22, she had long accepted that no one expected greatness from an Omega like her. She could not overpower anyone. She could not impress the warriors during training. She possessed no dazzling gift that earned applause in the crowded square. What she did have were gentle hands that calmed frightened animals, soothed fevers, and stitched torn clothing without complaint. In Raven Hollow, kindness rarely earned respect. It was often mistaken for weakness. A group of young wolves laughed as they hurried past, nearly knocking the basket from her hands. One offered an apology without slowing down. Another simply smirked. Emily smiled anyway, crouching to gather the scattered sprigs of rosemary before snow buried them. She had learned years ago that resentment was heavier to carry than forgiveness. The marketplace stood at the center of town, decorated with silver ribbons and lanterns that swayed gently above the crowd. Merchants called out cheerful greetings while children darted between wooden stalls, chasing one another through fresh snow. Music drifted across the square, but beneath the celebration lingered an invisible current of competition. Every conversation seemed to revolve around power, bloodlines, or the arrival of important guests expected before the next full moon. Emily quietly delivered her herbs to the infirmary before beginning the walk home. The narrow trail wound along the frozen creek just beyond the edge of town, where the noise faded into peaceful silence. She preferred this path. The forest never judged her. The towering pines never whispered that she was less valuable because she lacked strength. The snow accepted every footprint without asking who deserved to leave it behind. She had nearly reached the old wooden bridge when a low growl drifted from beneath the trees. It was rough, exhausted, and carried more frustration than menace. Emily stopped immediately. Another growl followed, quieter this time, accompanied by the faint scrape of movement against frozen ground. Most people would have turned back toward town. Stories about rogue wolves filled every fireside conversation throughout the territory. But something inside that weary sound made her hesitate. It did not remind her of a hunter searching for prey. It sounded like someone who had been fighting alone for far too long. Slowly, carefully, Emily stepped off the trail and followed the sound through knee-deep snow until the trees opened into a small clearing bathed in pale afternoon light. There, beside a fallen cedar, lay an enormous gray wolf with silver eyes unlike any she had ever seen. His thick coat was dusted with snow, one foreleg rested awkwardly beneath him, and despite the fierce warning in his stare, exhaustion shadowed every breath he took. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wolf watched her as though weighing an impossible decision, while Emily stood perfectly still with nothing in her hands except a loaf of fresh bread wrapped inside a linen cloth. She swallowed quietly, knelt several feet away, placed the bread on the snow between them, and whispered, "You don't have to trust me today. You only have to know I'm not here to make your life harder." The great wolf did not touch the bread. His silver eyes never left Emily, watchful and guarded, as though every kindness he had ever known had carried a hidden price. The cold breeze stirred the pine branches overhead, scattering tiny crystals of snow across his thick gray coat. Emily remained exactly where she was, resisting every instinct to move closer. Fear could be loud, but trust almost always arrived in silence. After several long moments, she slowly stood. "I will leave it here," she said softly. "Whether you eat, it is your choice." She turned away without another step toward him and walked back to the narrow trail. Only after she had reached the old wooden bridge did she glance over her shoulder. The wolf had not moved, yet somehow she felt his gaze following her until the forest swallowed both of them from view. By the time Emily reached her small cabin on the edge of Raven Hollow, dusk had settled across the valley. Her home was simple, built from weathered timber with a stone fireplace that took patience to warm and windows that rattled whenever winter winds swept through the hills. She unpacked the few groceries she had purchased earlier that morning and hung damp herbs above the hearth to dry. Normally, the quiet comforted her, but tonight her thoughts kept returning to the lonely creature beneath the cedar tree. Something about his eyes refused to leave her mind. They had not looked wild. They had looked tired. Early the next morning, Emily baked another loaf using the last of her flour. She wrapped it beside a small strip of smoked turkey and carried both back toward the clearing. Fresh tracks marked the snow before she even reached the fallen cedar. The bread from yesterday was gone. So was the wolf. For a heartbeat she smiled, relieved that he had eaten. Then another low growl echoed behind her. Emily turned slowly. The enormous gray wolf stood only 15 feet away between two towering pines. His expression remained stern, almost irritated, as though he disliked being discovered. She noticed he was standing more evenly now, although he still favored one front leg. Without speaking, Emily placed the second bundle onto a flat stone and quietly stepped backward. The wolf watched every movement. His ears twitched. His nose lifted into the cold air. Still he refused to approach until she had retreated several more steps. Emily laughed softly to herself. You really are grumpy. The wolf blinked once, almost offended by the observation. She continued smiling before heading back toward town. The following afternoon, heavy clouds rolled across the mountains, carrying the promise of another snowstorm. As Emily finished sweeping the infirmary porch, she overheard several hunters speaking near the stable. They complained about a dangerous stray wolf roaming the northern forest and insisted it should be chased away before the Winter Moon Festival began. One claimed the animal had unusually bright silver eyes. Another swore it had escaped every trap set for it. Emily felt an unexpected knot tighten in her chest. That evening she hurried home through thick falling snow. Halfway down the narrow path leading to her cabin, she stopped. Fresh paw prints circled the front porch. They were larger than before and ended directly beside her door. She slowly pushed it open. Curled beside the fireplace, dripping melted snow onto the wooden floor with an expression that suggested he had every right to be there, lay the same enormous gray wolf. He looked up at her with calm silver eyes, gave one quiet huff that sounded suspiciously like a complaint about the weather, and settled his head back onto his paws as if he had already decided this was home. Emily remained frozen in the doorway, snowflakes melting in her hair as she stared at the unexpected guest occupying the warmest place in the cabin. The gray wolf lifted his head only long enough to acknowledge her presence before closing his eyes again with the unmistakable confidence of someone who had already settled the matter. She could not help smiling. You certainly make yourself comfortable. His ears twitched, but he offered no apology. After placing another log into the fireplace, Emily filled a wooden bowl with fresh water and carefully slid it across the floor. The wolf watched every movement without showing fear or gratitude. He simply observed her with those remarkable silver eyes that seemed far older than any ordinary animal should possess. Only after Emily stepped away did he rise with quiet dignity, drink slowly, and return to his place beside the fire. The awkward stiffness in his front leg had improved, although she noticed he still favored it whenever he shifted his weight. Emily knelt several feet away, opening the small satchel she carried from the infirmary. I know you do not like anyone touching you, she whispered. But if you ever decide you trust me, I can help. That leg heal faster. The wolf answered with a low rumble that sounded less like a threat and more like a stubborn refusal. Emily nodded as though they had reached a reasonable agreement. The days passed gently. Each morning, she worked at the infirmary, treating winter colds, preparing herbal teas, and comforting frightened children who dreaded bitter medicine more than illness itself. Each evening she returned home to discover the wolf waiting for her. Sometimes he slept beside the fireplace. Sometimes he sat outside watching the snow fall across the valley. He never begged for food, never damaged her home again, and never accepted affection, but little by little an unspoken routine formed between them. Emily cooked enough for two. The wolf silently followed her whenever she gathered firewood. At night, he positioned himself beside the front door before she went to sleep, always facing outward as though guarding the tiny cabin from dangers she could not see. By the third morning, the entire village had begun talking about the mysterious stray. Hunters claimed they had followed enormous tracks through the forest only to lose them without explanation. Others insisted the animal was unusually intelligent, avoiding every trap before it could even be hidden beneath the snow. Emily listened quietly while organizing shelves inside the infirmary, saying nothing. She knew exactly where the wolf spent his nights. She also knew he had never shown the slightest interest in hurting anyone. As sunset painted the mountains gold and crimson, Emily carried a basket of fresh bread home through the falling snow. Halfway there, she noticed 3 local hunters standing near the trail leading toward her cabin. They examined a series of large paw prints pressed into the fresh snow with growing excitement. One pointed toward her home. Another suggested the stray had finally found shelter. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. She greeted them politely, hoping they would continue on their way, but they asked whether she had seen anything unusual around her property. She answered honestly that the forest was always full of surprises during winter. The hunters exchanged uncertain glances before deciding to search deeper into the woods instead. Emily waited until they disappeared beyond the pines before hurrying home. As soon as she opened the cabin door, the gray wolf was already standing, alert and silent. Their eyes met across the room. Without thinking, Emily crossed to the window and quietly pulled the curtains closed. "It looks like someone is searching for you," she said. "Do not worry. As long as you are under my roof, nobody is going to chase you away." For the first time since he had entered her life, the proud wolf slowly lowered his head, not in surrender, but in quiet acknowledgement, and something deep within his silver eyes softened, as though a lonely heart had finally remembered what safety felt like. The storm arrived before dawn, covering Raven Hollow beneath another thick blanket of snow that erased old footprints and softened every familiar path. Emily woke to the comforting crackle of the fireplace and the unmistakable feeling that she was no longer alone. The gray wolf was already awake, sitting beside the front window with perfect stillness as he watched the forest beyond the frosted glass. His silver eyes never blinked, almost as though he expected someone to emerge from the trees at any moment. Emily wrapped a wool blanket around her shoulders and stepped beside him. "You have been watching all morning," she whispered. "Who are you waiting for?" The wolf glanced toward her, but offered only a quiet breath before returning his attention outside. After breakfast, Emily prepared to walk into town despite the weather. She gathered fresh herbs, medicine, and a loaf of warm bread into her basket. The moment she reached for the door, the wolf stood and blocked her path. He did not growl. He simply planted himself between her and the entrance with calm determination. Emily tilted her head. "You think I should stay?" He remained perfectly still. She smiled gently. "I cannot. Mrs. Harper depends on her medicine, and little Noah still has that cough." The wolf studied her face for another long moment before stepping aside with obvious reluctance. To Emily's surprise, he followed several yards behind her the entire walk into town, always remaining just beyond sight whenever other villagers passed. More than once she caught glimpses of his gray coat disappearing behind snow-covered pines before anyone else noticed him. At the infirmary, the morning remained busy. Children laughed as they warmed frozen hands beside the stove. Elderly neighbors shared stories while waiting for herbal remedies, and Emily quietly moved from one patient to another with patient kindness. As she prepared another cup of tea, an unfamiliar sound drifted in from outside. Horses. Not one or two, but many. The cheerful conversations inside the infirmary faded as everyone turned toward the windows. A long procession of riders wearing dark cloaks entered the village beneath silver banners embroidered with the royal crest of the Northern Territories. Their horses were magnificent, their movements disciplined, and every face carried the quiet confidence of seasoned royal guards. Murmurs spread across the room almost instantly. Someone whispered that the Alpha King's elite guard had arrived. Another claimed the royal court had been searching the surrounding forests for days. Emily felt a strange uneasiness settle over her heart. She looked toward the distant tree line beyond the village square. The gray wolf was nowhere to be seen. Outside, Captain Nathan Holloway dismounted with calm authority and spoke briefly with the local pack leaders. Emily could not hear every word, but one sentence carried clearly through the cold winter air. "His Majesty disappeared 3 days ago. We believe he entered these mountains alone. Every cabin, trail, and shelter must be checked." Emily's fingers tightened around the warm teacup she held. 3 days. Her thoughts raced back to the lonely clearing, the exhausted silver eyes, and the quiet visitor who now slept beside her fireplace every night. She immediately dismissed the impossible thought forming in her mind. The Alpha King ruled the entire northern territories. The silent wolf waiting in her cabin was simply a stubborn stray who happened to appear at the same time. There could not possibly be any connection. Yet when she returned home that evening, she found the cabin empty for the first time since he had arrived. The fire still burned. His paw prints surrounded the front porch. But the gray wolf himself had vanished into the falling snow, leaving only silence behind and a feeling in Emily's heart that something extraordinary was about to change forever. Emily barely slept that night. Every gust of winter wind against the cabin walls sounded like footsteps returning to her porch, and every faint creak of the old timbers made her glance toward the door with quiet hope. Morning arrived wrapped in pale gray clouds, but the place beside the fireplace remained empty. The water bowl was untouched. The loaf of bread she had left on the table remained exactly where she had placed it. For reasons she could not explain, the little cabin suddenly felt much larger than before. She shook away the strange loneliness and prepared for another day at the infirmary, reminding herself that wild creatures belonged in the forest, not inside a home. Yet as she stepped onto the porch, she noticed fresh paw prints circling the cabin before disappearing toward the northern ridge. He had returned sometime before dawn. He had simply chosen not to stay. That quiet discovery brought an unexpected smile to her face. Throughout the morning, the entire village buzzed with speculation about the royal search. Groups gathered outside shops discussing why the Alpha King had vanished without warning. Some believed he had been hunting alone. Others whispered about an ancient curse tied to the royal bloodline, though no one could agree on the details. Emily listened without joining the conversation. She had no interest in gossip, but she could not stop thinking about the timing. 3 days ago, the royal guards had lost their king. 3 days ago, an injured gray wolf had appeared beneath the cedar tree. The coincidence lingered in her thoughts, no matter how firmly she tried to dismiss it. As afternoon faded into evening, Captain Nathan Holloway arrived at the infirmary with several members of the royal guard. They spoke politely with every healer in Raven Hollow, asking whether anyone had treated an injured traveler during the previous week. Emily answered truthfully. She had not treated any stranger. The captain thanked her with genuine respect, yet before leaving, his sharp eyes briefly settled on the faint traces of gray fur caught near the hem of her winter cloak. He said nothing. His expression barely changed. Still, Emily sensed that he noticed far more than he allowed others to see. After sunset, she hurried home beneath a sky filled with bright winter stars. The cold air shimmered with perfect stillness until a familiar shadow stepped quietly onto the trail ahead of her. The gray wolf emerged from between the snow-covered pines exactly as though he had been waiting for her all along. His thick coat sparkled beneath the moonlight, and although his stern expression remained unchanged, there was no distance between them anymore. Emily laughed with unmistakable relief. "There you are. I was beginning to think you had forgotten where you lived." The wolf released a quiet breath that almost sounded like patient amusement before walking beside her instead of behind her. Neither hurried. Neither needed words. When they reached the cabin, Emily noticed something different. The limp was completely gone. His powerful stride was smooth, confident, and effortless. Whatever injury had slowed him only days before had vanished without leaving even the slightest trace. She knelt beside him near the porch, studying him with gentle curiosity. "You heal remarkably fast," she whispered. The wolf lowered his head until his forehead rested lightly against her shoulder for the briefest moment before stepping back again. Emily froze. It was the first time he had ever chosen to touch her. The quiet gesture lasted only a heartbeat, yet somehow it carried more trust than any words could have spoken. Far beyond the cabin, hidden among the dark pines overlooking the valley, Captain Nathan Holloway watched the exchange in complete silence. One of the younger royal guards stepped closer and whispered, "Captain, shall we report that we have found him?" Nathan never looked away from the small cabin glowing warmly beneath the winter sky. After a long pause, he quietly answered, "Not yet. His Majesty has made his choice. Until the king reveals himself, no one disturbs the only place where he has looked truly at peace." The following morning dawned clear and bright. the fresh snow reflecting golden sunlight across Raven Hollow, as though winter itself had decided to offer the valley a rare moment of peace. Emily opened the cabin door with a basket of grain for the birds, only to discover the gray wolf already sitting on the porch, facing the rising sun. His thick coat shimmered with silver highlights, and his posture carried a quiet confidence that seemed even stronger than the day before. He turned his head when she stepped outside, watching her with the same calm expression that had slowly become familiar. Emily smiled warmly. "Good morning. I suppose this means you have officially adopted my front porch." The wolf blinked once before standing and stretching with effortless grace. There was no trace of his old injury now. Every movement was smooth, powerful, and strangely elegant. Emily noticed something else as well. Around his neck, hidden beneath thick winter fur, a faint silver marking briefly caught the morning light before disappearing again. It looked almost like an ancient symbol instead of a natural pattern. She frowned with quiet curiosity, but chose not to investigate further. Some mysteries revealed themselves only when they were ready. Together they walked toward the forest where Emily gathered herbs that only grew beneath old pine trees. The wolf stayed close without crowding her, occasionally stopping to study distant sounds long before Emily could hear them herself. More than once he gently nudged her away from patches of thin ice covering the frozen creek, almost as though he already knew where each hidden danger waited. Emily laughed softly after the third time. "You really believe I cannot take care of myself?" The wolf answered with an expression that looked suspiciously like disagreement. By midday they reached a quiet clearing where winter lavender still survived beneath the snow. As Emily carefully collected the delicate plants, she noticed a frightened fawn standing nearby with one leg trapped between fallen branches. Before she could move, the wolf had already approached the young animal. Emily expected it to panic, but instead the little deer became remarkably calm. The great wolf lowered his head with surprising gentleness, allowing Emily enough time to free the frightened creature. Once released, the fawn lingered for a brief moment, almost as though offering silent gratitude, before disappearing into the forest. Emily looked at her unusual companion with growing wonder. "Every story says wolves and deer should fear each other," she whispered. "Yet somehow every animal seems to trust you." The wolf simply turned away, refusing to accept praise. That evening, while Emily prepared vegetable soup beside the fireplace, someone knocked on the cabin door. Captain Nathan Holloway stood outside alone, snow resting across the shoulders of his dark cloak. Emily welcomed him inside, offering a warm drink before he spoke. The captain accepted with polite gratitude, but his attention drifted briefly toward the large gray wolf resting quietly beside the fire. Instead of surprise, Nathan lowered his head respectfully for the smallest fraction of a second before looking back at Emily. She noticed the gesture immediately, although she could not understand its meaning. Nathan asked only a few simple questions about whether she had seen unfamiliar travelers or anyone needing medical care. Emily answered honestly. Throughout the conversation, the wolf never moved. He simply watched the captain with calm silver eyes. When Nathan finally prepared to leave, he paused at the doorway and spoke in an unusually thoughtful voice. "Miss Carter, sometimes the greatest honor arrives wearing the humblest disguise. If someone extraordinary chooses to trust you, protect that trust. It may change more lives than you realize." Before Emily could ask what he meant, the captain stepped back into the falling twilight and disappeared down the snowy trail. She closed the door slowly, puzzled by his strange words. Behind her, the gray wolf quietly rose from beside the fire and walked to stand at her side. For several silent moments, they both watched the snow drift beyond the frosted window, unaware that before another sunrise the secret separating their two worlds would finally come to an end. The next sunrise arrived with unusual stillness, as though the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Emily awoke before dawn to find the other side of the fireplace empty once again. The blanket of snow outside remained untouched except for a single trail of familiar paw prints leading toward the old cedar grove where they had first met. She wrapped herself in her winter cloak without hesitation. Something deep inside her whispered that she needed to follow them. The forest welcomed her with quiet light filtering through frost-covered branches. Every step carried her farther from the village and closer to the clearing that had changed everything only a few days before. When she finally arrived, the great gray wolf stood waiting beneath the towering cedar exactly where she had first offered him a loaf of bread. His silver eyes reflected the pale morning sky, calm yet filled with an emotion she had never seen before. It almost looked like gratitude. Emily smiled softly. "I had a feeling you wanted me to come." The wolf slowly approached until only a few feet separated them. Instead of lowering his head as he usually did, he looked directly into her eyes. The air around them became strangely warm despite the winter cold. Tiny flakes of snow drifted gently through beams of sunlight, sparkling like scattered stars. Then the silver marking hidden beneath the wolf's thick fur began to glow. Emily stepped back in surprise. The faint symbol spread across his shoulders in delicate lines of light that pulsed like a quiet heartbeat. The forest itself seemed to awaken. Birds resting high among the pines suddenly fell silent. Even the wind disappeared. Before Emily could speak, distant voices echoed through the trees. Riders, dozens of them. Within moments, Captain Nathan Holloway and the Royal Guard entered the clearing from every direction. Their horses stopped at the edge of the snow-covered grove, but none of the soldiers reached for a weapon. Instead, every rider dismounted at once. Emily looked from the approaching guards to the wolf standing beside her, unable to understand why every experienced warrior suddenly lowered his head. Nathan stepped forward alone. His expression carried deep relief rather than alarm. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "the Northern Territories have been waiting for your return." Emily's heart skipped. She stared at the captain, convinced she had misunderstood. There was no king standing anywhere in the clearing. There was only the silent gray wolf she had fed, protected, and welcomed into her home. She looked back at him just as the glowing silver markings brightened once more. A gentle breeze circled the clearing, carrying tiny crystals of snow into the air like dancing light. The wolf closed his eyes. Warm golden light surrounded him, soft and brilliant without overwhelming the peaceful forest. Emily instinctively covered her face from the brightness. When the light slowly faded, the enormous wolf was gone. Standing in his place was a tall man with dark hair touched by the morning sun and unmistakable silver eyes that Emily would have recognized anywhere. He wore a long black cloak marked with the royal crest, yet his calm expression remained exactly the same as the companion who had quietly guarded her cabin every night. Captain Nathan and every member of the Royal Guard immediately bowed. Emily stood frozen, unable to move or even breathe. The stranger looked at no one except her. His voice was deep, steady, and wonderfully familiar despite her hearing it for the first time. "My name is Adrian Blackwood," he said gently, "and I owe my life to the woman who never asked who I was before choosing kindness." Emily could not find the words to answer. The man standing before her wore the bearing of a king, yet every familiar detail remained unchanged. The calm silver eyes that had watched her gather herbs. The quiet patience that had followed her through the forest. Even the slight tilt of his head as he waited for her response reminded her of the gray wolf who had slept beside her fireplace. Her heart raced with confusion, but not fear. Somehow, she had trusted those eyes long before she knew the name behind them. King Adrian Blackwood took one careful step forward, leaving a respectful distance between them. "I did not intend to deceive you," he said gently. "An ancient burden carried by my bloodline forces me into my wolf form whenever my spirit is pushed beyond its limits. 3 days ago I disappeared while traveling alone through these mountains. I remembered very little except exhaustion. Every person who found me before you saw a dangerous beast. You were the first to see someone who simply needed compassion." Emily lowered her gaze for a moment, remembering the cold clearing beneath the cedar tree, the untouched loaf of bread, and the lonely silver eyes that had never truly belonged to an ordinary animal. A quiet laugh escaped her despite everything. "You really were as stubborn as I thought." For the first time, the reserved Alpha King smiled. It was small and almost hesitant, but it softened the dignity in his expression until Emily recognized the same silent companion who had guarded her tiny cabin every night. Around them, the royal guards exchanged surprised glances. Few among them had ever witnessed their king smile so freely. Captain Nathan Holloway stepped forward carrying a neatly folded black cloak trimmed with silver thread. Adrian accepted it with a grateful nod before draping it over his shoulders. Then, instead of turning toward his waiting escort, he looked back at Emily. "Would you walk with me?" he asked. Together they followed the snowy path toward Raven Hollow while the royal guard remained respectfully behind. News traveled faster than winter wind. Before they reached the village square, nearly every resident had gathered outside. Conversations stopped the instant people recognized the royal banners. Curious faces quickly shifted to astonishment as they noticed the Alpha King walking beside the quiet Omega, who usually passed unnoticed through the marketplace. Emily suddenly became painfully aware of every eye fixed upon her. She instinctively slowed her steps, uncertain whether she belonged in such a moment. Adrian noticed immediately. Without speaking, he matched her pace. His simple gesture quietly reminded everyone watching that no one would rush her. The village elders hurried forward and bowed deeply before the Alpha King. Others followed until the entire square stood in respectful silence. Emily remained standing, unsure what she was expected to do. Adrian turned toward the gathered villagers instead of accepting their praise. His voice carried calmly across the snow-covered square. "For 3 days I lived among you without a crown, without guards, and without a title. Many searched for a king. Only one person cared for a weary traveler." His silver eyes found Emily once again. "Judge people by the kindness they choose when no reward is promised. That is where true strength lives." A quiet stillness settled across Raven Hollow. The same people who had once overlooked Emily now looked at her with entirely different eyes. Yet Emily herself had not changed. She was still the woman who stopped to rescue frightened animals, shared her last loaf of bread, and believed that gentleness was never something to be ashamed of. Adrian understood that better than anyone because she had shown him that truth long before she knew he wore a crown. Snow continued to fall gently across Raven Hollow long after the crowd had fallen silent. No one seemed eager to move, as though everyone understood they had witnessed something that would be remembered for generations. Emily stood quietly beside Adrian, still struggling to believe that the proud wolf who had stubbornly claimed the warmest place beside her fireplace was the same man every kingdom called the Alpha King. Adrian looked toward the familiar little cabin resting beyond the edge of the village. A faint smile touched his face. "For 3 days," he said softly, "I slept more peacefully in that small home than I have inside the royal palace in many years." A ripple of surprise spread through the gathered villagers. The palace was famous throughout the northern territories for its beauty and grandeur, yet their king spoke of Emily's modest cabin with unmistakable affection. Emily lowered her eyes with quiet embarrassment. "It was only a simple home," she whispered. Adrian gently shook his head. "No, it was the first place where I was welcomed without anyone expecting something in return." He slowly reached inside his cloak and withdrew a small silver cord braided with the royal crest. It was neither a crown nor a symbol of command. It was a simple keepsake worn only by members of the royal family during journeys away from the court. He held it carefully before Emily. "I carried this long before I entered the forest, yet while I wore it as a wolf, no one recognized its meaning. You never noticed it because you never searched for signs of wealth or power. You looked only at whether someone needed kindness. That is why you succeeded where everyone else failed." Emily accepted the silver cord with trembling hands. It was beautiful, but what moved her most was not the gift itself. It was the trust behind it. Around them, the royal guards watched with quiet respect. Captain Nathan Holloway smiled to himself. Everything he had hoped for during those anxious 3 days had become reality. Adrian turned toward his people once more. His calm voice carried across the snowy square with effortless authority. "Many rulers spend their lives searching for loyal subjects. I have learned that loyalty cannot be demanded. It must be earned through character. Emily Carter showed me that true strength does not roar. It listens. It comforts. It chooses compassion even when no one is watching." Then he faced Emily again. His silver eyes held the same warmth she had first glimpsed beneath the old cedar tree. "There is one more truth I wish everyone here to hear." The entire village waited in complete silence. Adrian's expression softened into the familiar look of the quiet wolf who had patiently waited on her porch every evening. People may believe that a king owns great lands, commands powerful armies, and rules countless lives. He paused before gently smiling. But they are mistaken. He took one respectful step closer, never asking more than she freely wished to give. "I do not belong above her because I wear a crown." His voice remained steady, filled with quiet certainty. I belonged to her because she offered kindness to someone who had nothing left to offer in return. Emily felt tears gather in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that the smallest choices of her ordinary life had changed two destinies forever. She smiled through the falling snow, and Adrian returned the smile without hesitation. Around them, the village no longer saw an overlooked Omega standing beside a distant ruler. They saw two people brought together by compassion instead of status, by trust instead of fear, and by a simple loaf of bread freely given on a cold winter afternoon. As the bells of Raven Hollow rang across the valley, the winter wind carried away old judgments, leaving only one truth echoing through the quiet mountains. Real strength had never belonged to the loudest voice or the highest throne. It had always lived inside the gentle heart willing to care for a lonely stranger without ever asking who he was.